Hi everybody and welcome back to my channel. Finally, I can talk about the Nikon Z9. I rented a camera for a week, used 3 different lenses with it, and I concentrated my review on bird photography because obviously 1 week is not enough to test every single aspect of this camera. Hopefully, you'll find this video interesting nonetheless, so let's get started. I don't have a lot of things to say about the design of the Z9, and I mean this in a positive way. Nikon has years of experience producing flagship cameras for the most demanding photographers, and the Z9 doesn't fall short. It's very comfortable to hold and very satisfying to use, so much that I quickly forgot the 1.3 kilograms of weight and simply enjoyed working with it. The buttons are easy to reach and give you a fast and precise feedback. For comparison, the camera is smaller and lighter than its DSLR counterpart, the Nikon D6, but a bit taller and deeper than the Canon R3. On top, we find a large monochrome LCD screen that displays a lot of information. If you toggle the on-off switch, you can increase the brightness, and doing that also activates the back illuminated buttons. The amount of customization is very good. There are 13 custom buttons, including 3 at the front. Additional buttons are found on select lenses, and Z-mount lenses also have a function ring, so there are plenty of possibilities to find your favorite setup. To be honest though, I didn't find the need to change too many things. The default configuration is already an excellent starting point. One complaint, and it's the same I have with other products, is that some buttons have more settings to choose from than others. It's a small thing really, but I don't understand why the same list of options cannot be given to all the buttons present on the camera. I was also surprised to find a few parameters are missing entirely, like the vibration reduction settings for example. If there is no switch on the lens, you need to use the I menu, the My menu, or the main menu to change that. The Z9 has a built-in vertical grip and, when using portrait mode, you'll find that a few buttons are replicated, including AF on and the AF joystick. All the buttons and dials designed for the vertical orientation can be locked so that you won't press them accidentally when working in landscape mode. The main menu system is typically Nikon and the same you find on many other cameras. There is the My Menu section where you can shortcut most of the items found in the main menu. The I menu that offers a quick selection of 12 settings can also be customized. The electronic viewfinder doesn't sport the most impressive specs for a camera of this level. However, I found the VF to be really good, with excellent brightness, clarity, and colors. It may not have the highest resolution or the largest magnification, but it is very well balanced overall. The rear monitor has a distinctive 4-axis mechanism. You can tilt it up 90 degrees like that, but you can also orient it on the left or right, and this solution gives you the possibility of a 90-degree position when working in portrait mode. The LCD is large and has a good resolution. There is touch sensitivity which allows you to do various things, including navigating the entire menu. The battery is very good. To give you a real-life feedback, I captured more than 3,400 images of birds in flight, recorded various 8K and 4K video clips with stabilization and continuous AF, and there was 59% of battery life left at the end of the afternoon, which is plenty to double all that. The Z9 uses two CF Express Type B cards. You have the user options to backup or separate RAW and JPEG files, but you cannot record videos simultaneously on the two cards. Then we have the following physical connections: microphone input, headphone output, Ethernet port, full-size HDMI, and a USB Type-C port that you can use to charge or power the camera. At the front, you find a flash sync terminal and a 10-pin remote terminal. And on the other side, there is a security slot where you can attach an anti-theft cable. Finally, the camera is equipped with Bluetooth and Wi-Fi capabilities and has a built-in GPS to record location data. This time, I'm not presenting to you the usual test to evaluate the image quality. I didn't have other cameras to compare the Z9 with, so I decided to spend all my time outside and evaluate the quality with only my wildlife images. This means the result you see is a combination of the sensor and image processor, of course, but also the lenses and the image stabilization because most of my photos were taken handheld. At the heart of the camera, we find a stacked CMOS sensor with 45.7 megapixel. It's plenty of resolution to resolve the fine details of animals, as well as cropping posts when you cannot get close enough to your subject. These photos were processed in Lightroom Classic with a small amount of sharpening applied. The raw files of the Nikon Z9 are very nice to work with. They are flexible, you can push the parameters with ease, and I like the color rendition I got from the camera and the lenses I used. But that is something you expect from a modern mirrorless product of this level. What happens with more extreme adjustments? Let's have a look at the second set of images where the camera's metering struggled to deliver the correct exposure. It's not just the Z9's fault. Birds are not easy subjects to meter correctly, and picking the right setting can be a bit of a gamble sometimes. I work in manual mode but with auto ISO, and often I get a few shots that are too bright or too dark. If we look at the first photo, I recovered about 2.7 stops to get the kite properly exposed. This generated a bit of noise and green color cast, particularly on the wings, but with some local adjustments using masks, I got a decent result out of it. The second image is more severely underexposed. It's almost a 4 stops recovery, and the color cast as well as the noise level are more invasive. The bird is smaller in the frame, so the details are smaller too and get mixed up with noise more easily. If I look at the trees in the background, there is also a bit of banding, which reminds me that of the Nikon Z7. This is where you start to see the limit of the Z9 sensor. I can try to reduce the noise, particularly that of the background, but the details on the kite are more difficult to recover entirely. On the other end of the histogram, we can look at the highlights. Digital sensors are weaker in the bright zones than in the dark areas, and the Z9 is no exception. Overexpose more than one stop, and it becomes difficult to save everything. In this third image, I was able to recover most of the details on the kite except the brightest part near the edge of the wing. The fourth image is brighter to begin with, and more details are lost in different parts of the animals. Next, we have the high ISO performance, and this plays an important part when working in nature. You don't always have the brightest lens available. Very often, you need a fast shutter speed, so the ISO will inevitably go up, not to mention if you use teleconverters and the sun decides to disappear behind clouds. The Z9 has a normal range of ISO 64 to 25600, with extended values going down to 32 and up to 102,400. Considering the high megapixel count, I was satisfied with the quality of the raw files up to 6400 ISO. Push further up and you start to lose more details in favor of noise. To be honest, images taken around 12800 ISO still look fine, and anything around 25600 ISO will give you a decent result when there is no alternative. You can improve the final result with a bit of post processing using masks once again. I really like the AI subject selection in Lightroom Classic. It works well to quickly isolate the bird from the rest of the image. I don't add too much sharpening or noise reduction on the subject, but then I duplicate and invert the mask, which allows me to work on the rest of the image, and there I can be generous with noise reduction, knowing it won't affect the bird. Of course, these are just a few quick examples to show you what is possible. I'm sure some of you have a different method. Perhaps you use a different software as well. If you'd like, you can share your experience in the comments. The Z9 features an electronic shutter only. You heard that correctly. You won't find the traditional mechanical curtains that cover and uncover the sensor when you take photos. This means no mechanical shutter and no electronic first curtain shutter. There is one physical curtain that comes down when the camera is turned off, but that is simply a sensor shield and serves the purpose of protecting the sensor when you change lenses. Nikon is obviously confident the readout speed of its 45 megapixel sensor is fast enough to not need any mechanical components anymore. The camera seems to cover all the basics of a mechanical shutter and then some. More importantly, I didn't find any issue with distortion, aka rolling shutter, in the more than 11,000 images I captured with this camera. Another characteristic is the blackout-free live view experience. Taking images doesn't alter the view in DVF or LCD screen in any way. There are no blackouts, no delay, and no lag. The transition between composing and pressing the shutter button is seamless. This is possible thanks to the image processor that is powerful enough to handle live view and data recording simultaneously. This technology, first seen in the Sony A9, is the best thing you can wish for when following fast and erratic birds, although I like it for anything really. The electronic shutter allows continuous shooting to reach 20 frames per second. You can increase the drive speed further up to 120 frames per second, but you'll have to settle with JPEGs only. Also, the resolution drops as you increase the frame rate. Here's a quick video where I combine all the frames of different sequences taken at 120 frames per second. Limitation of JPEG and megapixel aside, it is an impressive speed to work with. When we say drive speed and frame rate, we also say buffer, and the Z9 gives an excellent performance. At 20 frames per second with RAW, the camera works at full speed for approximately 4 seconds but doesn't drop the speed that much afterwards, which means you can continue to work in optimal conditions. You won't find the usual options concerning raw compression and bit depth as with other Nikon cameras. Instead, the Z9 has three different raw modes, lossless compress, and two high efficiency options. Unsurprisingly, choosing one of the two high efficiency modes increases the buffer. If you select a faster drive between 30 and 120 frames per second, the camera offers a decent duration at the maximum frame rate but then stops shooting entirely rather than continuing at a reduced speed. One last thing to talk about in this chapter is the pre-release capture mode, a feature wildlife photographers can find very useful. It allows you to save frames before you press the shutter button all the way down, a great aid to capture moments that are difficult to predict. You can choose the amount of frames the camera will record before the shutter is fully pressed. For example, if you choose 1 second and you're working at 120 frames per second, the camera will effectively save 120 frames before the shutter is released. You can also choose for how long the camera continues after you started taking pictures. The Z9 features a hybrid autofocus system and works with 120 AF calculations per second, a specification it shares with the Sony A1. For comparison, the Canon R3 does 60 calculations per second. The software includes machine learning, and the Z9 can recognize humans, animals, including birds of course, and various vehicles. Subject detection works really well, especially when it comes to speed and precision. The Z9 can recognize not only the body but also the head and the eye of the bird and will give priority to the latter as much as possible. What impressed me the most is the camera ability to track the head even when the bird is not in a favorable position. Look at these two photos, for example. The camera kept the head in focus when the bird faced the other way. The animals are recognized quickly even when they are distant, meaning small in the frame. For example, here the Z9 detected the black bird straight away, despite the distant position and the grass in the foreground. Another example, here as well, no problem detecting this blue tit despite being small in the frame and not in an optimal position concerning the light. And here is a third example when animal detection was effective, and locked on this cute tree creeper right away. The interesting thing about animal detection is to see how this technology behaves when there are elements covering part of the subject's body. In many occasions, the Z9 managed to focus on the eye successfully, ignoring any potential obstacle. Okay, here I was probably just very lucky with this photo, but still, it's quite an impressive picture considering it was taken rapidly just before the bird hid entirely. With all that said, subject detection is not 100% perfect. An element in the foreground can mislead the autofocus, other things such as water splashes can confuse the camera, or occasionally the Z9 will just miss the subject if his texture is too similar to that of its surrounding. In this other example, there were too many elements in front of the bird for the camera to recognize it in the first place, so I had to use a small autofocus error instead. Occasionally, the camera may stop detecting the head or the eye for a brief moment, only to resume a few seconds later. If you're taking pictures in continuous mode, you can end up with a few shots where the focus point is in the wrong place. If we look at this picture here, the camera didn't see the eye of the robin and focused at the center where the small autofocus error was. Because of the shallow depth of field, the body is sharp but the head is soft. A few frames later, eye detection was working again and I got the result I wanted. To be fair, no cameras I've tested so far with this technology are perfect, and overall the amount of failed shots is low, so the Z9 is right up there with the best. The Nikon works a bit differently than other cams I've tested. Animal detection is available only with select autofocus areas, not all of them, and is active only inside those areas. Let me show you what I mean by that. For example, if you choose wide small and the bird goes outside that autofocus frame, the camera will stop tracking the animal and focus where the autofocus point is. This may seem like a limitation at first, but it is simply a way to have more control of what the camera does. It can also help to give priority to one animal over the other if more than one subject are in the frame. Just move the autofocus area near the bird you want to focus on. If you want the animal to be tracked on the entire frame, you have two options. The first is 3D tracking. Initially, you need to position the small autofocus area precisely on the bird, but once the autofocus is engaged and the camera tracks the animal, it can follow it on the entire scene. It works pretty well, and this setting rapidly became my favorite method because it gives more freedom of composition without the need to move the F point manually. The second option is to use the auto area mode. Here the bird is detected automatically, and if there is more than one, you can switch between them with the AF joystick, which is quick and convenient. I found 3D tracking to be more precise once the autofocus is engaged, but with static or slow moving subjects, auto area AF can work well, especially if the animal is in a clear spot without a busy background or disturbing elements in the foreground. And now, the stars of the show, my beloved red kites. The Z9 gave me one of the best autofocus score ever. In the 3 days of shooting at the feeding stations, trying all sorts of settings, the camera always delivered a very consistent performance. This is the autofocus score I'm talking about. As usual, green includes 100% sharp images only, blue also includes slightly soft images. You can also read the settings that help me achieve this result, and I'll talk about those in a few minutes. Like its main competitors, the key of such a high keeper rate is because the camera rarely misfocuses on the bird and it rarely switches to the background. It is also very quick to react and correct focus when needed. If there is one frame out of focus or slightly soft inside a sequence, the Z9 will take one or two frames at the most to make the correction. As I said in the previous chapter, the camera is capable of tracking the birds when they are small in the frame as well as when they are in various positions. The keeper rate is very similar whether the bird flies against the sky, so a clear background, or against hills and trees, meaning a busy background. Subject detection combined with 3D tracking gave me the best result with the kites. As I explained earlier, the initial focus area is very small, so you have to engage the autofocus when that area is precisely over the bird. If not, the camera can easily focus on something else, background most likely, and lose the bird before it even started tracking it. It just requires a bit of practice. Once the lock is successful, the camera won't let go easily. The wide large area is another option, but despite the name, it is not very big. It is larger than the 3D tracking initial point, so it provides more flexibility while you're composing, but once the autofocus is engaged, you need to keep the bird inside that wide large area or over the edge of that area at the very least. If the bird goes outside of it entirely, the Z9 will likely focus on something else. Here again, it is a matter of practice and getting the experience. Wide large didn't give me the same result as 3D tracking, but was not too far, and is worth keeping in mind as a second option, especially if you want to limit where the camera focuses in the frame. You can also create your own custom area with C1 and C2. Without subject detection, the keeper rate was always lower by 10% or worse. 3D tracking in particular struggled, losing the kites more easily in favor of the background. So, at the risk of stating the obvious here, animal subject detection is the setting to keep active at all time. The other setting that made a difference is focus tracking with lock on. There are two parameters to adjust. The first is blocked shot AF response. Choose one and the Z9 will respond right away if something passes in front of your subject. Choose 5 and it will maintain focus on the original subject rather than shifting immediately. Choose any other value to find a balance between these two behaviors. The important thing to understand here is that when using 3D tracking, this setting always works with the number 3 value, so right in the middle. When using the wide large area, it will make more of a difference, although in my test with the red kites, I didn't find a big gap in the keeper rate. With the value of 1, I have examples where a second kite passed in front of my subject and the camera didn't flinch, probably because the action was just too quick for the Z9 to react. It will be more effective if you're tracking a bird that goes behind a tree and appears again a few seconds later. The second parameter in this setting is called subject motion. Steady is designed for subjects that move at, you guessed it, a steady pace. Erratic is for subjects that are prone to sudden starts and stops. Red kites definitely have a more erratic behavior, slowing down then accelerating, as well as changing direction very quickly. The erratic setting gave me the best results, and it was the one that allowed my keeper rate to go above 90%. The only time when the combination of 3D tracking and erratic subject motion settings struggled was when there were a lot of birds in the frame. Here, the Z9 initially focused on the kite at the bottom right, despite the tracking point being over the kite at the center. Thankfully, it only took 5 frames for the camera to switch to the subject I wanted. The erratic option can also confuse the Z9 a little when the bird is small in the frame and close to a busy background. Here, the colors were probably too similar to the bird's feathers and the focus point shifted to the trees. But we're talking about a small amount of autofocus images out of the thousands I captured. Next, we have the dry speed, and here I got some curious results. First of all, the best AF score was obtained with 20 frames per second and 45 megapixel RAW files, as well as 120 frames per second and 11 megapixel JPEGs. So the Z9 seems capable of delivering the best performance regardless of the continuous shooting speed selected. I said seems because when I tested the 30 frames per second mode, the score was lower. The camera had a harder time correcting focus quickly, so instead of having one or two autofocus images in a sequence, I ended up with 5 or even 10. Maybe 30 frames per second and full resolution images are too much for the camera to handle. Finally, this is how the Z9 compares to some of its mirrorless competitors. Note that the A1 score is valid at 20 frames per second. At 30 frames per second, it is slightly lower. You can check the dedicated article on my website to read more about all these cameras and birds in flight. The link is in the description. The Z9 features 5-axis in-body image stabilization or built-in vibration reduction, as Nikon calls it. The official rating is 6 stops of compensation, but with wide life and long telephoto lenses, the performance will be influenced by VR on the lens more than that of the sensor. I was able to capture sharp images at 1/50 of a second with the 500mm f/6 or 1/400 of a second with the 800mm and the 2 times teleconverter. Pretty good performance. There are two settings available: VR Normal and VR Sport. Both can automatically detect the type of movement and compensate vertically or horizontally as needed. VR Normal is supposed to enhance the performance further, but it has one drawback. There is a jiggle in the viewfinder every time you press the shutter button. It only happens with VR lenses according to the user manual, but it's very annoying. The sport setting doesn't have this problem, so it's the one I decided to use. Note that this only affects the photo mode, not the video mode. Where the performance of the Nikon system really surprised me was during video recording, and that's why I included these two things in the same chapter. The Nikon Z9 is an impressive camera for movies. It can record in a lot of different ways, as you can see in this table. I made several clips in 8K 25p and 4K 120p, most of them handheld, and I was really impressed by how stable the footage is. It's not perfect by any means, you get a bit of jittering, which is more visible in 8K, and small jerks, but when you consider the focal length used, it is really nice to see that all the clips I recorded are usable. The best recording format in this case is 4K 120p because you can slow down the video on a 24p or 25p timeline and get a 4.8 or 5 times slow motion effect, which makes the shaking smoother and less distracting. It also extends the duration of parts of the footage that don't have jerks, giving you more seconds of fine stabilized video. The performance is pretty good with continuous autofocus. The Z9 was able to follow the fast red kites with precision, as you can see. Subject detection works as well as with still photos, and there are two parameters to control the speed and reactivity of the autofocus for video. The most impressive moment I recorded is a scene of a curlew catching worms in the wet sand. I had the 800mm f6.3 with the 2 times teleconverter attached, and I was working in DX mode. Now, the thing to understand is that in APS-C mode and 4K 120p, the sensor crop is more severe, 2.3 times instead of the default 1.5 times. So here we're talking about a total equivalence of 3680mm in terms of field of view. All I had to help my arms was this tiny monopod feet you're seeing right now, which is part of my iFootage Cobra 2 monopod. The result, in my view, is simply stunning. This is the first full-frame mirrorless camera that I was able to push that far. Here is some more footage for you to enjoy. I used the flat picture control, which lacks a bit of sharpening by default, so I added a small amount in post to make the image a bit crisper. This is all the gear I use for this review, and if you're interested, I can share a quick feedback about the three lenses. Overall, I found them to be really good when it comes to optical quality and autofocus performance. And I've already praised the VR stabilization in the previous chapter, so I won't repeat myself. The autofocus score for birds in flight was the same with the 100-400mm and the 500mm. With the 800mm, it was lower, but I believe there are two main reasons for that. It was the first day of testing, so I wasn't using the best settings yet, and I was a bit too close to the action, which made tracking more challenging. I should have positioned myself further back. The lenses work well with the teleconverters, and even the 2 times teleconverter didn't compromise the autofocus or the optical quality too much. My favorite lens to use was the 500mm. I first saw it at the UK launch event for the original Z6 and Z7 cameras, and I was impressed by how compact and lightweight it was. Walking in nature reserves with it made everything more enjoyable. The focal length and fastest aperture combination is a very good compromise, and it was nice to see how well this F-mount prime works on the Z9 with the adapter. The 800mm is another product that gave me a very positive impression. It is bigger and has a higher price tag than the other two lenses I used, but we need to put that into perspective. The older DSLR version, the 800mm 5.6 for f mount, is much larger, heavier, and way more expensive. Nikon decided to give Z mount users something more affordable and lighter, and I like this philosophy. I can't comment on the difference in optical quality between the old and new version, but I can say the Z mount lens delivers excellent performance with just the loss of one third of a stop. The 100-400mm is a lens I used a bit less, mainly because of the lack of more time, but it does everything you expect from a zoom of this kind. It offers great versatility and works really well with the two teleconverters. Perhaps my only criticism is the price. I find it a bit expensive. The Nikon Z9 has been praised in many reviews since it came out, and I can confirm it lives up to the hype, at least when it comes to bird photography. The camera delivers fine image quality, top of the class autofocus performance, excellent drive speed, and buffer. It is a great choice for video with beautiful 8K footage and a large selection of formats for internal recording. The combination of 4K 120p and VR lenses can make wonders, and since the release, Nikon has published generous firmware updates that added a lot of new features to the Z9. Sure, I could find a few things to criticize, like being limited to JPEG when shooting at 30 frames per second or faster, and banding that can appear when doing heavy shadow recovery on the RAW files. But truth is, we can find something negative to say about pretty much every camera if we try hard enough. It's fair to mention these drawbacks, but it is also honest to say that none of these limitations got in the way of what I wanted to do with the camera. I also like what Nikon is doing with the Z-mount telephoto lenses. In addition to the ones I tested, there is a 400mm 4.5 that I'm eager to try, and there is a 200-600mm on the roadmap, in addition to the Holy Grail 400mm 2.8, which has a built-in converter by the way, and of course the 600mm f4. Give it a few years and the Nikon mirrorless system could become the most complete for wildlife photographers, in terms of lenses at least. Even more so if we would get support from third party brands. And that, of course, doesn't count all the DSLR lenses already available, including that beautiful 500mm prime. And that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe, and don't hesitate to leave a comment if you have any questions. Until next time, bye bye.